I served over 13 years in the British Army, initially following a fairly typical young officer path with service in West Germany, Northern Ireland, Falkland Islands, Kenya and UK. The second part of my military career as a Russian and German-speaking British liaison officer with the British Commanders-in-Chief mission to the Soviet forces in Germany, known as BRIXMIS. We were based in Potsdam in the east and also West Berlin. This is a subject which is quite well documented these days, but before the fall of the Berlin Wall was an organisation shrouded in layer upon layer of misinformation and generality. This small team, along with Soviet, French and American sister units, was established in the late 1940s to assist with the movement of German misplaced refugees back to their homes after the end of the Second World War. As tensions heightened in the 1950s and the Iron Curtain went up, they became important outposts in potentially hostile territory. Our operations were conducted exclusively in the Soviet zone, marked in red here on the map. The Russians had teams operating in the French, American and British zones, known as SOCMIS. The public and still vital BRIXMIS role was liaison with a group of Soviet forces in Germany. The missions had freedom to roam the territories allotted to them without any jurisdiction from East German police, military or the Stasi secret police, although they did try to interfere. This photo shows me liaising with a Stasi operative. Their car was hidden in the bushes on the other side of the railway line, and he was trying to persuade me to join him in a forbidden area so they could harass me. Our less public role was intelligence collection, including close-up technical photography of military equipment, orbats, and the organised collection of rubbish from dumps where Soviets threw away their paperwork. The days before shredders were heady days. This photo shows me at the far end of a tank firing range chatting with a Soviet sentry in his little shelter, always a useful source of information. These people were often left for days in place with no proper briefing as to their responsibilities and little food. Maybe we're seeing this lack of information and support for troops again in Ukraine. The range itself was used by the latest T-80 tanks at that time, and our very first view and collection of a piece of explosive reactive armour from the firing end a few weeks later. And this talk is to try to give you insights about Russian and Russians, or, as we called them then, the Soviets. I recall an incident in 1987 which happened in a small German town south of Berlin called Zeitz, where my tour NCO and driver were taking a walk in the centre of town. I had remained in the vehicle since all tour vehicles were always manned for security reasons. The driver hurriedly returned to the car to tell me that Staff Sergeant Geary had been forcibly detained by the East German police and taken to the police station in the town square. We quickly drove to the location where I was able to get visual sight of Geary and him of me before the curtains were pulled. This was illegal as the Germans had no jurisdiction. So I went to the local public telephone booth, no mobile phones in those days, to call for the local Soviet commandant to visit and help us. 2 hours later, he arrived in his bright green Volga, and I joined him in the back of the car. The first question he asked with a smile was how he could get at the Germans. I was amazed, but briefed him about the wrongful arrest. He smiled and said he would sort it. He summoned the chief of police to assemble all members of the police station outside in a square shape. Staff Sergeant Geary was brought out into the middle, and the arresting officer was made to perform a humiliating public apology to him for his wrongful detention. Whilst this was happening, the Soviet officer looked across at me and winked. It was a surprising turn of events, and on reflection I understood that the post-Second World War arrangements had not changed in any way here in East Germany. The Soviets were still very much in charge, in contrast to West Germany at the time, and the Russians were not going to let the Germans forget. We were also allies as he saw it. Not how any of the Western forces in Europe at that time saw it, that's for sure. And it's become clear to me over the last several years that the withdrawal from Germany in 1991 onwards was about the two sides agreeing to withdraw from Germany and the reunification of the two Germanys. Both NATO and the Warsaw Pact felt they were there to defend against a potential aggressor, which is not how I saw it at all during the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact was always the aggressor and the threat, in my doctrine. So, at the end of the Cold War in 1991, I would suggest that Russia saw us as allies again, and as was the case at the end of the Second World War, we misunderstood them entirely. My second insight comes from discussion in 1988 with a Soviet GRU captain, the same organisation which carried out the Salisbury poisonings, one afternoon in Potsdam, when we had an opportunity to sit and make small talk. He remarked to me that he often found it surprising that we should believe NATO was Russia's main threat. He explained that the Yellow Peril, in other words China, had long been the main threat to Russia. It was that discussion way back in the 1980s which has often framed some of my thoughts over the years about the sense of vulnerability the Russians have about their national borders. The Chinese border with Russia is long and generally pretty porous, with many Chinese settlers inside Russian territory. Having China on their very border has always been a huge concern, but little that the Russians can do about it. So when, in the last decade, new oil and gas pipelines were being laid to China from Siberia and Russia, and supplies were being sold at an almost cost price, I realized that if they did not meet the Chinese demand for oil and minerals, then one day the Chinese would come and fetch them. Now, in reality, we are seeing that happen anyway with the settlement of Chinese in Siberia. So, do not underestimate the fragility and complex nature of the Russia-China relationship. And Russia is definitely the junior partner, and probably always has been.